Seekers. Hope you had an amazing Easter. Today we're going to be talking about investing during the fall of the US empire. And today we're going to be doing it in three parts. Firstly, we're going to be discussing the falls of previous empires. Then we're going to be crystal balling a little bit about what could happen this time and whether there is going to be a fall of the US empire. And thirdly, and most importantly, what I'm doing and how to protect yourself during these times. So let's start with what's happened in the past. So Ray Dalio has done some awesome work on the rise and falls of empires. I'll paraphrase some of the trends so that we can spot a trend and then we can try and make some forecasts. And once we make some forecasts, we can then start to think about how to position ourselves as investors seeking financial freedom, no matter what our politicians and what our leaders do as they throw around weapons of mass destruction and financial weapons of mass destruction. So in the last two empires were the Dutch Empire and the British Empire. And they really did have similar cycles. Ray Dalio makes a case that they were fueled by large investments in a unified vision. So the haves and have-nots work together in a more unified way with a shared vision and a common mission to build the next empire. And that leads to massive investment in education, and massive investment in education and a harmonious between the haves and the have-nots means that you end up with mass innovation. In the case of the Dutch Empire, the most important mass innovation was the creation of the ship so that they could go navigate and go and share through the innovation of the capital markets. They invented the stock markets, the bond markets, the corporation with the Dutch East India Company, and the banking system that was the early evolution during those times. And so a lot of that happened, and what it meant is that you could take the ship and you could go excavate and you could go and get treasures. And that was then a risky business. So they invented the capital markets where people could lend money and they could share their risk, pool it together in exchange for a share in whatever they got when they went on their excavations. This leads to a ginormous period of productivity growth where everybody is investing their returns. You don't have large wealth inequality. People are working and getting wealthier. Capitalists are inventing and getting wealthier. And that leads to an innovation cycle that perpetuates itself. And you go on to a boom thanks to capital markets. And then governments, they borrow in the bond markets. And they start to invest in productivity increasing, i.e. invention of railroads in the case of Britain and whatever it may be. Now, at this stage, remember, during the last two empires, all of the currency, so the Dutch guilder in the case of the Dutch and the British pound in the case of the British, were convertible into gold. And so the invention of banking was that you could take your gold, you could put it at a bank, and then you could receive a receipt for that gold in the form of a paper note and more recently a digital currency at the bank. And so that would then be used as if more and more international trade was happening. The first world reserve currency was the Dutch guilder. And so then more and more people start using the Dutch guilder for international trade. In the case of the British Empire, more and more people started using the British pound as the world reserve currency and started settling international trades. Now, as a currency becomes more and more important in the world and for settling international trades, you can then borrow against it. And as people and governments borrow against their pound, you end up issuing more paper receipts for gold than you have gold itself. And that's okay as long as no one wants the gold. And the important part there is that you can use it, more and more people start to use it as a reserve currency to settle international trade, then they can borrow more and more against it. Now, once you have the world reserve currency and the ability to borrow against it, that normally marks the peak of the empire. And the peak of the empire is where you have to defend the empire. And so the fall of all of the empires is ginormous spending on military. Because when you spend on military, you get to increase the size of the empire. Or you get to defend the empire, because as you have a world reserve currency, anyone else that spends more militarily will end up trying to make a threat against the empire. So you have that typical top. Now, what happens is that when the banking system starts creating this infrastructure, and then the central bank starts devaluing the currency by borrowing more and more against it, and the government borrow more and more against it for military expenditure and social welfare programs, you end up pushing up assets, and this drives wealth inequality. So the rich start to get richer and the poor start to get poorer because the government intervene and monetize too greatly. And when you have these times of wealth inequality, and you have some kind of overexposure, some kind of event in the financial system, it leads to, on their extremes, extreme populism, where you have the far left feeling like they've been shafted by the far right getting more lazy as they get more rich, and also worrying about the ginormous taxes and confiscation of their assets. And then they start looking at other currencies and other places to invest their money for fear of confiscation and for fear of taxing in order to redistribute wealth. And then at its extreme, you get a populist leader, someone from the extreme left, that then comes along and does a revolution, or you have a civil war between the extreme left and the extreme right, or you have an external threat, somebody else that fancies taking over that empire-like status. And Ray Dalio talks about the indicators are large wealth inequality, large popularism to the left and the right, as a result of that wealth inequality, and then ginormous devaluations of the currency and debt in order to defend, and then an external threat. And the external threat comes from two forces. Somebody else that decides that they're going to invest in education, and they come around in a unified vision, and then they come along. The people that are working in the world's empire become very expensive, very complacent, and believe that they're going to be in the world empire forever. And therefore, companies start investing in other countries where labor is cheaper. And therefore, the innovation that was created in the empire starts to export its way over to the country where labor is cheaper. And then they get more productive and they start creating innovation, and they start then becoming the next threat to the superpower economy. Then you have some kind of event, some kind of external war, some kind of internal war, either a revolution, a civil war, or an external war. And that triggers people being concerned about the debt. And so then people in the previous empires would go to those, they would look at the debt and they would be concerned about the creditworthiness, whether they're going to win or lose the war, and start to sell those assets and invest in other opportunities. And then when you start to see seizures, demands for large taxes on the rich, when you start to see lots and lots of popularism, when you start to see investment in foreign assets, people start to ask for that currency in hard money. And then there is not enough gold or silver to cover the world reserve currency, and you end up with a modern day run on a bank, and then that leads to default, or the central bank prints more and more money, which then leads to hyperinflation. And then at that moment, a military force externally comes along, takes advantage of the situation, and you have the steady decline of an empire and a lag of about 10 years or so where that world reserve currency still is the world reserve currency, but then these people start using the new currency in order to settle trades. Exactly what happened to the Dutch Empire happened to the British Empire when it moved over to the US Empire. So those are the cycles to look out for. The falls of the empires is when you have popularism, extreme left and extreme right, that creates a lot of divide that can lead to civil war and can lead to revolutions. When you have a ginormous monetization, ginormous increase in the money supply, ginormous levels of debt that becomes unsustainable, and then an event that causes ginormous military expenditure and unproductive investment. So rather than using that debt to stimulate business and productivity, it ends up all going into trying to stimulate your capital markets, which is financial speculation, which is unproductive. It just makes the rich richer, the poor poorer, which drives more wealth inequality. Or it goes to military spending, which is unproductive spending in order to maintain the empire. And the burden of maintaining the empire becomes overwhelming, and someone more productive comes along as a result of all of the brain power of that country being put into the outsourcing of labor into the more productive, cheaper country. So now you know what it looked like with the Dutch Empire and the British Empire and the US Empire. You can see those cycles, right? What could happen today? Well, I don't like to forecast doomsday scenarios, and I don't wish to be scary, but in investing, you have to be prepared before it is too late. And so when I released my video my video series in 2011-12, I uploaded a video from a talk I gave in 2009 called The Great Depression of the 2020s. In 2020, I released a video series which was on how to prepare for these types of scenarios that lead to monetary renegotiations. Now, what I didn't talk about is at each fall of the empire, you have a monetary renegotiation, which is where the rules of money are changed. So in the US empire, you had Bretton Woods, which is where the US, because it was the dominant military power with the highest level of expenditure, the most efficiency, and less wealth inequality, and a common vision around the land of the free and the land of opportunity. That common vision drove it into the world reserve currency status, and therefore you had the rise of that US empire. So what does it look like where we are right now? Well, the current US empire is the US, obviously. The world reserve currency, at an extent we've never seen before, is the US dollar. But what's different in this time versus the previous empires? Well, what's different this time during the previous empire is that in 1944 rather, when the Bretton Woods came around, the US negotiated itself to be the center world reserve currency, and 32 other central banks said that we'll come along and convert our currency against the dollar, and the dollar must be convertible into gold. And then organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were there in order to get dollar loans into developing countries to ensure that international trade was being settled in dollars. So that's what was negotiated. Now, in 1971, just like the British Empire removed the convertibility of its currency into gold, the US Empire also removed the convertibility of its currency into gold because it needed to expend ginormously. Therefore you had the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme created, where you had to continually roll over the debt, and you had this infrastructure, or as it were, investment and stock market boom based upon low suppression of interest rates, the removal of free markets, and the ginormous boom in wealth inequality, as those that had assets end up getting richer, and those that don't end up deep in debt, on the street, and in poverty. So I think you can see in America that there's large poverty problems and large wealth inequality, with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. This leads to extreme popularism. So one could say that Bernie Madoff was the extreme left and Donald Trump was the extreme right. In the middle, you had, I guess, Biden, which one could argue is more of a reasonist, but others would argue is the extreme left. Therefore, you end up with this ginormous popularism. So you need a trigger event. What types of trigger events? And I'm not saying these things are going to happen, but these are some of the things that I'm preparing for as we go into the final section on how to protect yourself. Well, you've got large wealth inequality. You've got the rising empire in China, which is par for par in terms of domestic output. And you had over $1 billion. And I remember people talk about, well, yeah, the China is not a threat, it's communism. No, China is led by the China Communist Party, but it has state capitalism, which took 1 billion people out of poverty, and that led to the rise of the empire, where technological innovation and ginormous innovation has been happening in China. And many of the American people are looking at that and saying, well, no, we're more productive, we got more output. Communism never succeeds. So it's a different way of organizing an economy that took $1 billion out of poverty, 1 billion people rather, out of poverty. So you have this rising empire called China. You have this conflict between Russia and Ukraine at the moment that looks like it will escalate towards NATO. And you also have extreme popularism. The run on the Capitol Hill under the leadership of Trump, when the leadership of the United States changed, led to these extreme popularism that you're seeing in a very divided states of America. And so what could happen next? Well, let's play a few things. Current news, let's look at some current news. Well, Elon Musk is deciding that he wants to put in a takeover bid for Twitter. Twitter banned Donald Trump from using Twitter. If Elon Musk takes on Twitter and fulfills his promise of turning it more into a freedom of speech platform, then you would imagine that Donald Trump's Twitter account would be re-enabled in time for the 2024 election. Now, there will be a ginormous, if you thought the last US election was insane, wait till the next one. And I forecast and potentially one scenario to be prepared for, which would be an indicator, in my perspective, would be that Trump would get back in power, and that could potentially lead to a civil war in terms of the extreme left and the extreme right and the divided states of America. Once Trump gets back, he will be blamed for the fall of the empire, just because he's that type of person. The fake news, as it were, will then say that the Trump is the reason that this is all happening, and they get their perfect fall guy for the decline in the United States. Now, what tools do they have to maintain their power? Well, they have 0% interest rates. They're about to create a ginormous recessive environment if they continue to increase interest rates in order to control inflation, because that would need to create a depressive environment. Are they going to allow the stock markets to crash and the real estate markets to crash in order to control inflation? Well, it depends how bad it gets. So the causes of inflation are excessive money printing, but it's also factoring in all the debt that went to unproductive use. So the pandemic led to a ginormous amount of debt that was unproductive. It was just paying for people not to work and paying for people to be in lockdowns. These types of trends mark the ginormous over-indebtedness that we're experiencing in the United States right now, extreme wealth inequality, the rise of a new contentious superpower, and I believe at some stage, when Trump gets elected, there'll be a strategic moment where Russia and China, depending on the outcome of the Russia-Ukrainian war, will need to decide what happens next. And they could decide that it's a strategic moment when America's debt is at its weakest, when wealth inequality is at its greatest, and when popularism is causing the most amount of conflict, to make a strategic attack on NATO and engage in a World War III. I hate to say these things, but we need to be prepared for these things. And so what happens in the past during events like that? Well, in the past, people would take their treasuries, the US government's debt, and their US dollars, and the credit rating of those lending money to the government would start to be quantitative eased more and more and more, where the central bank would buy the debt rather than genuine investors. That's one of the big signs as well, that the central bank is buying more and more of the debt versus genuine investor demand. China has those $4.5 trillion of treasuries that it can strategically, at the right moment during the upcoming currency wars, decide either to not roll over that debt and invest it into another currency, or purchase Russia's gold if it wants to accumulate more gold, because in these times everyone wants to convert their currencies into gold and then invest it into the rising next power. And so these are the types of trends that you need to be on the lookout for. So those is, one set of events that can happen. Now, what's different this time? Well, the last wave of innovation globally led to the creation of a ginormous Ponzi scheme that led to everybody using real estate as a savings account. And that led to the innovation in the capital markets, which led to the rise of US and UK investment banking. And US and UK and global investment banking took all of that retail banking mortgages, packaged them all up, and sold them to everybody's pension and investors. That led to the 2008 subprime crisis, when investment bankers took over Iceland, exposed the weakness of the system, that then led to the realization that because the retail bank was no longer taking the risk, it was passing the risk on to pensioners, and therefore it just did as many mortgages as possible and fueled a debt-led economy where everybody was using real estate and property as their savings account in order to combat the inflation that was happening as a ginormous increase in the debt and the stimulus of stock markets that was happening through government, government initiatives and central bank-led initiatives. Now, because of that, there is the largest debt cycle that we are experiencing, and a ginormous increase in military expenditure could lead to a downgrade in the credit rating. People starting to decide that in negative real returns of lending to the US government no longer makes sense. At the moment, people are lending to the US government for negative returns. Inflation is about 8 to 9%. It's a lot more if you use the old measure of consumer price index. And treasuries are paying about 1.75% or whatever it may be. Haven't looked because it's so out of whack at the moment. So people are willing to lose at the best 6% a year just to not hold their money in a bank and instead use the credit rating of the US government. That is a big, big telltale sign that investors and people with all the capital in ginormous wealth inequality will need new homes to put their money. Now, what new innovations have we had? Well, firstly, the traditional assets. So let's move to part 3, where we talk about how can we position ourselves. So if you go back to the free video series that I released in 2000, if you want to get a copy, if you didn't watch it, go to retirementplanb.com/book. That's retirementplanb.com/book. You can get a free copy of the book that I wrote in 2011, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, which was the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. and the 4 video series on the Great Depression of the 2020s. And it also gives a 15-hour free masterclass on exactly, I invested $1 million live and showed the performance in 1 year, and went through how to position yourself even if you don't have savings and just a regular income. So you can still get that for free and binge in that. But I talked about you're betting on 3 outcomes. The first is that the Federal Reserve can figure out another way of using financial innovation in order to fuel another debt cycle and another boom cycle. There is one more tool. They don't have interest rates. QE is becoming less and less effective because it's now led to inflation, and they need to cartel and get control of inflation because wealth inequality and popularism could lead to ginormous, either revolutionary or civil wars in their extremes. And so what do they need to do? Well, their one tool they have left is FedCoin, central bank digital currencies, because in the last wave of technological innovation and a result of the financial crisis and the explosion of the financial system in 2008 that was bailed out, Bitcoin was invented to create an alternative financial system. On top of that innovation, you have had stable coins being created where they just put the ability to transfer dollar value on a blockchain. Then you have had central banks looking at that innovation and figuring out what they're going to do it. Now, this is a shift. Think of a central bank digital currency as communism on a blockchain. Communism on a blockchain means that essentially either the government and treasury create it, I created previous videos on this topic, or the central bank creates it. And either way, that is a ginormous increase in the money supply, but not backed by debt. It's an injection in the money supply. And when you inject the money supply not backed by debt, it's a movement away from free market capitalism to more organized planned markets of a form of neo-communism through currency policies, because that currency has to be injected into the economy how the government, through their fiscal expenditure, design that it is fit. It might be backed by bank runs. It might be backed by foreign defaults on debts or whatever it may be. There's all sorts of ways that they could organize this. But the central bank digital currency is the last tool to save fiat and maybe create another US bull cycle. And so I have a portfolio that benefits from the continuation of the normal. During the shifts, you have had the change in empires. You've had people claiming gold and a run on gold in order to exit from the assets and the currencies of the previous empire. And the rich try to do that faster for fear, because all of the have-nots are asking the haves to pay more tax, and they start scared of confiscations, especially during times of military conflict, because during military, I'll cover another video on this, the whole economics change during times of war. If you'd like that, let me know in the comments section, and we can discuss the types of policies and the economics of war, and what it actually impact that has, and the extreme measures that governments take as the world care less about protecting assets and more about protecting people, or winning the war, as it were, which may have nothing to do with protecting people. But yeah, we can do that in a previous video. Let me know in the comments section if you'd like that. But during the change of the empire, people convert to gold. Now, there was the innovation of Bitcoin. So it makes very reasonable sense to me that gold historically has not made you wealthy. Gold is like a bank account at times of uncertainty. So gold has preserved its wealth for 5,000 years. Nothing else has ever done that for that long. And so therefore, purchasing gold is not an investment during this time. It's a bank account during this time. And so during times of change of empires, people use gold as their bank account. Now, what's one of the challenges of gold? Well, you need to hedge some of those risks. And those risks are that most people can't keep gold at their house in large quantities because it's dangerous and it's hard to spend. And therefore, for international trade, you have to send it on flights to try it. Now, when nobody accepts the credit rating of each other's currencies, so just like what you're seeing right now, with the fall of sanctions that happened as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, you tend to get people deciding to transact without the dollar. And so you get the fall of the petrodollar, and you get different countries figuring out how to settle, and that's a very, very, very big telltale sign that something is changing. Now, when people start to use gold to settle international trade, it's very, very tricky. So Russia right now has its gold in its central bank. If it wants to trade, it's very, very tricky to do it with gold. So it normally issues hence why fiat currency was invented, because it solved the problem of the transportability of gold by having a note and a digital version where you could trade instantly. But would a percentage of that money decide to go into Bitcoin? Well, my projection is yes. That although people will use gold as their bank account, they want returns. And the returns for the last 13 years have been produced in the highest form in Bitcoin. And it also solves a very real problem. The transportability for the settlement of international trades, political neutrality to engage trust between countries that want to engage in commerce with each other, the ability to store it for every individual, every company, and every country without having to leave it in custody and in times when you have record levels of distrust during wars and conflicts. So Bitcoin solves a real problem, not just for the central bank, but for the central bank, for the country, for the companies, and for the individuals. And so in times of uncertainty at the moment, Bitcoin has never been alive, because it's only a 13-year history, during a time of world conflict. So we don't know the answer of what will happen. My speculation and my guess is that short term, it will be treated as a speculative asset, and stock markets tumble during times of economic uncertainty and close, by the way. And if you look back in history, the winning countries where their stock markets were open tend to be related to the outcome of the conflict. And the countries that lose, if you look at like the German stock market after the last war, or the Japanese stock market, they were obliterated into nothing. And they were just closed for like 5 years, so no one had any liquidity. So if you're retiring at a time when a stock market is closed, during the problems that we also have, I'll cover that in a separate video if you like it, the issues with retirement liabilities, and those as well are very problematic, at a time when they're investing in negative returns through bonds, at the time of a changing shift in the empire, you need to do things very, very differently. So what will happen? Well, I forecasted a monetary renegotiation. I still think that's going to happen. I think those that get a seat at the table are going to be those that have the highest debt to GDP ratios, and also the outcome of the conflict between Russia that escalates, I think, to NATO. And when it escalates to NATO, the superpower economy, China, decides how it's going to position itself as it has been empire building quietly on the side during these times. And so you have to, so I have exposure to the America managing sustain the same. And gold is where people will put their assets. And I think that will be a bank account. And I think that Bitcoin becomes where sovereign protection happens, that then generates the return, that then becomes a geopolitical, neutral, apolitical currency and world reserve currency, but based upon voluntarism and connected to no country. That we have not seen before. the ability to have a politically neutral money, i.e. gold, that can be transported globally and can be used to store very easily for the individual, the company, and the country. And because it is still speculative, don't get me wrong, gold is a store of value, Bitcoin is a speculative store of value. Gold has 5,000 years of history, Bitcoin has 13 years of history. That is what can generate returns in changing and shifting times and moments. So this is why I state, and I'll summarize, that today is the most interesting and exciting time to be alive in financial history. Some people are going to get really hurt if they're doing the same thing and expect the same result based upon what has happened since the creation of the US fiat Ponzi scheme and the creation of the US empire that rose and hit the world reserve currency status in 1944, that is now at the end of a debt cycle with a rising power, ginormous wealth inequality, and probably a ginormous popularist, far left, far right that could lead to conflict at the same time as an external military threat with North Korea, Russia, China, and various other empires, and then a combined force called NATO, that we all need to be protecting ourselves because we need to get on the right side of financial history. I said the way that I do it, I outlined it, is an investment in the maintenance of the status quo. An investment in gold being where people go when they sell all their treasuries, when they sell their US dollars, and they look for other assets. I believe they will look for assets in China, which has a very controlled system in terms of free capitalism. However, the Shanghai and the Beijing Stock Exchange is not the same as the US in terms of free markets, but at the same time, the regulators in the US have got very complacent of their position and are either going to embrace innovation or they're going to shut down innovation. Now, where are they going to invest? Well, I think they're going to invest in countries that are embracing innovation. Who's the only country in the world that has made Bitcoin legal tender, decided to reinvent their stock markets and securities markets based upon Bitcoin markets, and also owns a load of Bitcoin with their treasury? Well, there's only one country at the moment, which is El Salvador. But I think more and more people are going to copy. And these is why the countries that adopt first, you could have one of the biggest shifts in wealth inequality. I don't think everybody, is going to invest in these emerging countries. It will still be speculative, but I think you could see a ginormous investment boom in the countries that have invested in political neutrality as legal tender. I also think that there is a rising power. The empire has been built. There'll be a lot of investment in China. There will be a move towards gold, which expose the weaknesses of the financial system, but the dollar is no longer convertible into gold, so that leads to the issuance of a central bank digital currency. And I believe the smart move for every individual, for every company, and for every country to receive more speculative returns is investing in digital, hard, sound money. There's only one of those, and that's Bitcoin. So I think it is a very, very interesting time. And if we get a lot of that innovation that's happening in the decentralized financial markets, now that we have had the upgrades, now that Lightning Network is getting adoption as a payment rails, and now that technology can be built on top of that in order to launch stable coins and maybe decentralized finance and some of the other things, but all built upon a foundation of digital hard sound money. Or you get a continuation of the ultra speculative markets where you can bridge from Bitcoin to alternative blockchains, and then people have to take much, much higher risks because they're engaging in more centralized, connected, that are more like securities because they're connected to people and companies types of innovation like we have right now. And the interesting thing is the countries that push back on those industries the hardest, and the countries that embrace the industry the hardest, could receive the most investment, a boost to their capital markets, and a politically neutral legal tender to use whatever comes out of the monetary renegotiation, the currency wars, and the battle to build central bank digital currencies backed by fiat currencies with these international financial institutions like World Banks, Bank of International Settlements, international monetary funds, all competing with the existing superpowers like Europe, like US, competing with upcoming superpowers like China, competing with other forces. And then you have these large unions like NATO and Europe and various other things. It's a massive wave of complication, but I just shared with you exactly how I'm positioning myself so that whatever happens, whether it's inflation, whether it's deflation, whether it's economic growth, whether it's economic decline in whatever country, and the monetary renegotiation takes whatever form it takes, and the fact that we now have digital hard sound money that exists on a politically neutral basis, and countries are deciding where they stand on the right side of financial history, I position myself for those three outcomes, and then I will always give as much commentary as I can, as much new information that comes through, and I hope this has been interesting. So in summary, we shared the typical cycles and the rise and falls of an empire by going through Ray Dalio's work on the previous empires and the rising new empire. We also covered what some forecasts and some wacky theories or crazy theories that Elon Musk could buy Twitter, Twitter puts back Trump, Trump becomes the winner of the 24 election, that leads to mass popularism, that then leads to bigger rich-poor divide and the fall of an empire, mass monetization as the wars escalate and it moves into ginormous monetization, just like we saw in the pandemic. How do you position yourself? Well, I invest in the status quo, gold being the shift during the monetary renegotiation, and Bitcoin giving everybody, individual, the opportunity to own their own money, spend their own money, and have monetary policy that is politically neutral and fixed in supply. Political neutrality is is normally what causes increase in the supply and the increase that can lead to either hyperinflation or military forces expending in order to become a world superpower reserve currency. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get really hurt. Others are going to do really well. Subscribe to this channel, like this channel, share this channel, put it on social media. I want more and more people to see this content because I think we are getting closer and closer and closer to making sure that everybody is positioning himself and thinking about these concepts of what it means for them and their financial future. Good news. I am during the Easter weekend, I managed to write a big chunk of my new book. Really excited about releasing it out there and doing it something exciting so I can really go into more detail in these books. But in the meantime, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and YouTube will notify you each and every day when we go live. I want to do it with peace. I want to do it with love. I want to do it with unity. And that is what Bitcoin gives the opportunity to do, while all of the leaders and fiat currencies and central bank digital currencies are creating political turmoil and wars. Peace.